Those who first landed on these shores were pioneers. Those who discovered the West were pioneers. And there were those who brought the civil rights movement to Illinois, not in the 1960s, but in the 1870s. They were also pioneers.
The call to freedom for the nation's enslaved population came on January 1st, 1863, with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Lincoln's Act was important because slaves immediately translated his actions into a general order of emancipation. It really wasn't that by law, in law, or in fact. But the slaves started to leave the plantations whenever they heard cannons in the distance because they knew something good could happen. Chicagoans interpreted the proclamation of January 1st, 1863 as the opening of a door that couldn't be closed. And in fact, in subsequent years, they would celebrate on January 1st, 1863. This was the day of emancipation. This was the day of Jubilee.
Historically, the state of Illinois had struggled with the issue of slavery. In 1818, the year that Illinois became a state, it did so with a tremendous amount of anti-black sentiment.
We were one vote away from being a slave state. One vote would have made the state of Illinois a slave state like Mississippi, Missouri.
In fact, in 1819, severe restrictions were imposed on Illinois' free black population in what became known as the Black Codes. Under these laws, blacks could not live in Illinois unless they met two conditions. First, they had to present a certificate proving they were not slaves. Second, they had to post a $1,000 bond. In addition, the state constitution was amended to prohibit blacks from voting, testifying in court against a white person, and serving in the military. Even free blacks had to constantly be on guard against whites who ran a reverse underground railroad from homes like the Hickory Hill Plantation, where free blacks could be sold back into slavery. Blacks in Illinois were still governed by these laws, even after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed.
The Illinois General Assembly rescinded the Illinois Black Code that year, a month before Lee surrendered. But the Black Code was an embarrassment to Northerners in the state. To people living in the middle and the southern tier, they loved it because they could control the black population.
By the time the Civil War ended, 1 in every 7 men in the Union Army was a black man, some of them from Chicago.
April 9th, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, you had an Illinois unit, the 29th, made up partially of men from Chicago, a small number from Chicago, sitting in the middle of the battle formation, laughing and joking, celebrating how they had brought Bobby Lee to his knees. They had emancipated their own people.
Thousands of blacks flocked north to Illinois. They thought the great emancipators' home state would be a land of great opportunity. By 1870, Illinois' black population had more than tripled. The new residents settled in the state's growing manufacturing centers, among them Rockford, East St. Louis, and of course Chicago. 1870 was also the year that the Illinois legislature was shamed into granting blacks in the state the right to vote. A short year later, after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, Republicans and Democrats set aside their political differences and formed a unified slate of candidates to pull the city back together. They called it the Fireproof Ticket and slated the wealthy tailor, John Jones, to run for a seat on the Cook County Board. Jones became Illinois' first black elected public official over 130 years ago.
So that tells you something about the white electorate and their feelings towards at least certain blacks in terms of office holding. John Jones was reelected in 1872, and then a third attempt at election failed.
Several years later, John Williams Edinburgh Thomas entered the political arena. Thomas, like most black men at that time, was fiercely loyal to the Republican Party.
He was born in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1840s, and he was a slave. The family that raised him gave him an education. He settled on the south side of Chicago, near south side of Chicago, and he and his wife opened up a grocery store.
Thomas became well known throughout the 2nd District. And in 1876, Republicans slated him to run for one of the district's 3 seats in the state legislature. His candidacy outraged a very prominent Republican in the district.
We do know that he was opposed by Robert Todd Lincoln, who was son of the President of the United States, who had a strong antipathy toward African Americans in general.
Thomas, however, was elected.
So when Thomas ran in 1876, the black community was very small. Of a town of about 400,000 people, the black community was about 5,000. So we're looking at less than 2%.
In the 1870s, you could either vote for one candidate and give them 3 votes, or you could vote for 3 separate candidates. And so we suspect that part of his success was that people bulleted their vote, especially within the African American community, for John W. Thomas. But there wouldn't have been enough African Americans, even if all of them had bulleted their vote, to elect him. So he obviously must have had contacts, if not a good reputation, in the white community as well.
Prior to Thomas's campaign for office in 1876, the United States Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act. However, in 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court declared this act unconstitutional, solely because it allowed blacks equal access to public places. Thomas took up the cause.
John W. Thomas then rushed in a state Civil Rights Act, which contained a public accommodations provision which was very similar to that of the 1875 national law and very similar to that of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And Illinois was the first state to have a state Civil Rights Act created in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision.
Though enforcement was rare, the precedent this bill established represented a significant moral victory for Illinois' black citizenry. However, between 1876 and 1914, there was always one, and never more than one, black man seated in the General Assembly. George Ecton, a hotel doorman, succeeded Thomas, with the help of a small, aggressive group of white Republican Party bosses who doled out money and political jobs to blacks who could get out the vote in their wards.
These were districts which were 70, 80, 90% black. So that white leaders in those areas, especially white business leaders in those areas, often found it in their interest to get their legislative agenda executed by black legislators.
Ecton's successor, prominent Chicago attorney and nationally known civic leader Edward Morris, was also bankrolled by one of the white Republican bosses, Judge Elbridge Hannessy. Initially, Morris served just one term, but he returned a decade later, this time courtesy of a black patron, Robert Motts, a high-profile gambler who ran an illegal numbers game called Policy.
Robert T. Motts, who was the gambling boss of the city of Chicago and also who ran one of the most famous African-American nightclubs in the 19th century, the Pekin Theater, where Ethel Waters and others performed. And Ed Morris introduced legislation to legalize what essentially was policy, to legalize gambling. And Robert T. Motts ended his political career because even though he ran gambling on the south side of Chicago, he didn't want it legalized.
One of Morris's successors, John Buckner, tried diligently to have the all-black Hannibal Guard considered a regiment of the state militia.
The male ego needs an outlet to show courage. And the militia unit was one. Every ethnic group in Chicago had a militia unit before, during, and after conflicts with other countries or other sections of the country. The blacks by 1872 had organized the Hannibal Guard. Now, I don't know if there was a connection between the 29th Illinois, which was the all-black Civil War regiment, and this militia unit. But I'm pretty sure someone in Chicago had to have known that the 29th had served valiantly and was there at Appomattox. The Hannibal Guard does evolve into the 9th Battalion, which by the time the Spanish-American War took place, 1898, had become a full-fledged, recognized regiment of the Illinois National Guard, the 8th. Without the actions of State Assemblyman Buckner, there wouldn't have been an 8th Illinois Regiment, so he's very important.
Buckner also championed the issue of labor violence. Employers often recruited blacks as strikebreakers, which made them targets for angry strikers. In one of the most violent incidents, dozens of black laborers were murdered at a plant in downstate Spring Valley.
A great deal of the attention I found of many of the earliest legislators was to protect the civil liberties of African Americans accused of crimes, or to protect them from violence.
Following Buckner into the legislature was attorney John G. Jones, whose outspoken advocacy earned him the nickname Indignation Jones.
He seems to have pretty much launched his career on the fact that he was a burr under the saddle of virtually every leader, black or white, in the city of Chicago, and that was part of his charm. He got the name Indignation because he'd call these rallies, these indignation rallies, when he saw any example of discrimination or when he thought that the race was not being respected, when some public official made a statement that he thought was outrageous or insulting.
Jones' successors, Edward D. Green and Dr. Alexander Lane, also fought hard for their black constituents. They fought for consumer protection for blacks, who often fell prey to unscrupulous and bigoted merchants and loan sharks. And they fought for equal access to public accommodations, even though Thomas's civil rights law had been on the books for decades.
The second decade of the 20th century, 1910, is an interesting decade. There are 44,103 African Americans in the city. People live along Dearborn Street, in Armour, in large numbers, in various type residences. There are many churches. They have a lot of businesses along State Street, from 24th Street probably south to 35th or 39th Street. There are professional people in that area. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams has his offices out south. His hospital, of course, Provident, is down at 29th and Dearborn. It's a vibrant community in the making.
The fight for equal rights even extended to cemeteries.
We think in terms of Oakwood Cemetery, which is a primary, the graveyard for the right people, meaning those people who can afford to be buried there. Prior to 1917, it was open to black people. You got black people buried in Oakwood who were buried in 1890, 1860, 1870. It was only after the restrictive covenants came into play, set into motion by the Chicago Real Estate Board, did it become Jim Crow.
The election of Robert R. Jackson marked the first time that more than one black representative was seated during a General Assembly session. He would serve with Benjamin H. Lucas. Smiling Bob, as he was called, was a major in the Black 8th Regiment, which won him tremendous respect. He was also the first black legislator in the Illinois General Assembly to serve 3 consecutive terms.
So he was this wonderful combination of a hail fellow well met who advanced up the political ladder because he knew everybody and everybody liked him, but he also was a very, very good legislator and very eloquent, though he wasn't known primarily as a public speaker, very eloquent in defending civil rights.
Jackson was not only a successful Illinois legislator, but he later had a successful career in Chicago politics as alderman for the 2nd and later 3rd Ward. The most colorful of these early black legislators was Shedrick B. Turner. He was elected from the 1st District.
Shedrick Turner had a newspaper, the Illinois Idea, and what he did primarily was he said nice things about churches, and churches gave him money, and he then used the paper basically to publicize himself. The paper's primary purpose was to publicize his political career.
Sandbag, as his detractors labeled him, lost his first re-election bid due to a criminal indictment and other scandals. But he would return to Springfield in 1918, serving 9 years, the longest tenure of any of his predecessors. There were 2 other black Chicago Republicans in Turner's 1918 class, lawyers Adelbert Roberts and Warren V. Douglas. Illinois was a hotbed of racial hostility during their tenure. In 1919, one of the most infamous riots began where Chicago's White Beach at 29th Street adjoined the Black Beach at 25th Street.
A youngster out on the lake on a raft went past an imaginary line and was stoned and fell into the water and drowned. And then there was fighting on the beach between black and white adults. It led to fighting in the black community and then fighting over around the stockyard areas. That is, whites attacked blacks around the stockyard areas and the blacks attacked the whites in the black belt.
This racial hostility was rooted in the fear that the growing political power of blacks would mean fewer jobs and less housing and educational opportunities for Chicago's immigrant population.
Because blacks are so political savvy in the 20th century, they do not content themselves with 2 spots in the city council. They get what they can get, and it happens to be 2 committeemen's posts, you know, in the 2nd and 3rd wards also. The committeeman's post is very important because the committeeman, as a party leader, has control over the jobs.
Attorney Edward H. Wright became the city's first black ward committeeman. Known as the Iron Master, Wright was a political boss in every sense of the word. He built a powerful organization by doling out government jobs. His loyal lieutenants fanned out across Chicago's Black Belt, delivering huge numbers of black voters.
As Republicans, blacks grew to lead the city in the percentage of getting out the vote. Overall, the black percentage from the teens into the 20s was the highest in the city of any ethnic group.
And in the 1920s, he is engineering the rise of several black legislators, or the advancement of several black legislators.
From the period 1920 on to about 1960, you have blacks in large numbers, perhaps more than the black majority, voting blacks into state offices. By 1924, the first black state senator, Adelbert Roberts, takes office. You always have now 2 or 3 black men sitting in the Illinois General Assembly.
State Senator William E. King owed his political career and his 4 terms in Springfield to his mentor, Oscar DePriest. A persuasive and eloquent speaker, King was a vigilant civil rights activist. Among his more memorable pieces of legislation was a bill to abolish Illinois' Ku Klux Klan. One of the more accomplished was Charles J. Jenkins, who became the first black man to ascend to a leadership position, serving as the chair of the powerful Appropriations Committee.
Whenever the NAACP in Chicago wanted something done, you saw Jenkins active, introducing a bill or speaking out for that bill. His name seems to stand out above all others. And there were others active, but Jenkins was always being praised.
It was 1927, and Big Bill Thompson, reputed to be Chicago's most corrupt mayor, decided to return to public office. Thompson was immensely popular with black voters.
Thompson said, let's be fair to everybody. I can have black friends, I can have white friends, I can have friends from all faiths and nationalities. So they liked him. They called him a second Lincoln. They looked upon him as a second emancipator. He was fair. That was the key thing.
It was Wright who initially promoted Thompson in Chicago's Black Belt. Now he owed his allegiance to Thompson's opponent, Republican Governor Lynn Small, who had appointed Wright to the Illinois Commerce Commission.
When the former Republican mayor decides he wants his job back in 1927, black leaders have to choose. If they choose Big Bill Thompson, their political careers are safe. If they choose the Republican governor, if they get on the wrong side, then Big Bill Thompson pretty much ends their political careers, and he ended the political career of Ed Wright, who was the most powerful black politician in the state. And that was a lesson which was not lost on one of Ed Wright's lieutenants, a young Republican at the time named Bill Dawson.
By 1932, 750,000 Chicagoans were unemployed, homeless, and hungry, forming long lines outside soup kitchens, patiently awaiting their small share of the day's rations. Hope, but not prosperity, arrived in the person of Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt, who offered America something he called a New Deal. Black Republicans in the 1932 legislature, King, Jenkins, Harris B. Gaines, William Warfield, and Senator Adelbert Roberts, countered with their own plan.
Many of these legislators in Springfield become Republican New Dealers, and you began to look at the legislation they introduce, and they're calling for relief, or they're introducing legislation which is very much progressive in the New Deal tradition.
In the midst of these hard times, there was a spirit of celebration, as Chicago hosted the World's Fair of 1933, saluting a century of progress.
When the World's Fair of 1933 began, the imprint of the black presence in Springfield is felt up here on the Chicago lakefront around 12th Street in the lake. The Colored World's Fair Committee, the Chicago NAACP, and other groups had been pressuring to make sure that blacks enjoyed themselves at the fair, and that state funds be made available, and that city funds. And here you have a good example, you know, in the 1930s of a collaborative effort between civil rights advocates, organizations, and their state legislators, you know, in getting the job done. Now, these were not great victories. They were not monumental victories of the type we became familiar with in the 1960s, but they mark the entry of blacks into a new era of state politics.
And there would be plenty to do. Across the country, bad economic times had strained black citizens' patience with the Republican Party and its president, Herbert Hoover. When the votes were counted, Hoover lost his re-election bid by a landslide. But in Chicago's Black Belt, he won by a huge margin because of black loyalty to the Republican Party.
They stayed with the Republican Party during the first couple of terms of Roosevelt, about 32. I would say the 1932 to 1936 election, there was not a large number of black people who moved over to the Democratic Party.
One of the first to do so, however, was Dennis Aubrey Smith of East St. Louis. In 1935, he became the first black Democrat in the General Assembly. The tide in Chicago also changed when the venerable Republican leader William Dawson switched his party allegiance.
Late in 1939, I believe it's November or December, Republican William Dawson shifts from the Republican to the Democratic column. He is offered a committeemanship in the Second Ward. And he tells people around him, I have been a loyal Republican, and I'm starving, and I get nothing. The Democrats have offered me something quite practical.
When he came in to the party, he just marched in. All he had to do was come on in.
You see blacks moving en masse for the first time towards the Democratic ranks, to the Democratic columns. But I believe the slow movement had to do with racial loyalty, racial ideology. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and Thompson, had been the party that stood by African Americans when the Democrats were lynching blacks in the South. And you have to remember that President Roosevelt was not that popular. It was Mrs. Roosevelt who in the 1930s courageously stood up for African American rights. There was no anti-lynching legislation passed because the president wasn't about to alienate his Southern political Democratic base.
The thing that helped us more was those checks that Roosevelt sent out. And we said, go ahead and bite the hand that's feeding you. Go on back and get in the bread lines.
By the mid-1940s, Dawson was in Congress, and his organization had sent the first 3 black Democrats from Chicago to the state legislature. Attorney Christopher C. Wimbish to the Senate, county government employee Fred J. Smith, and civic leader Cornel Davis to the House.
You couldn't get a sandwich downtown in Springfield when I was first elected. I was the most surprised man in the world. I didn't know that city, it was worse than Mississippi. Now that's right. Of course, they try to deny it, but they lies. Your top black people would go down there, and people would pass the bar. Lawyers, they would go down there, and they couldn't get anything to eat downtown. You had to go way out there where black people live, on East Jefferson Street, Monroe and all that, way out east there. And I fought it every step of the way.
It was a fight John W.E. Thomas thought he had won in 1885. He probably never dreamed that it would still be an issue for any black person nearly 60 years later, and certainly not state lawmakers. In 1956, Attorney Cecil Partee was tapped by Dawson for a seat in the new 22nd District. No one had told Partee what to expect on the first day of his new job.
You know, they open up the session and then they pay you. The first job I ever been on, when he paid you for 2 years the first day you got there.
2 years after Partee won his seat, 4th Ward Committeewoman Floyd Clemens was elected as the first African-American woman to serve in the Illinois General Assembly. She arrived in Springfield at a time when Davis and Smith had struggled for nearly a decade to address the issue of workplace discrimination. They had finally mustered enough votes to establish a Fair Employment Practices Commission.
Prior to that time, the only area, the only avenue for making a discrimination complaint on employment had to come from the individual who was aggrieved by a situation. The idea for the commission to have the power was because the commission had the capability of looking at an entire industry and in determining a great deal more than an individual, whether there was or was not discrimination within that industry. And then they the members of the commission, could initiate a complaint and not have to rely solely on an individual who had been aggrieved.
The concept of the Fair Employment Practices Commission was groundbreaking, and it had taken 20 years.
And that was a very hard-fought battle over the years, and there was a great deal of resistance to it. But finally, we got it passed.
A diluted version of the original bill was the only way Davis and Smith could win the support of their white colleagues, and the signature of Governor Otto Kerner. Once it was law, Davis, working in the House, and Partee, now in the Senate, slowly strengthened this legislation with a series of amendments.
We made it one of the finest FEPC laws in the country, one of the finest.
Change was in the air during the turbulent 60s. Organized protests against racial discrimination spread from the Deep South to Richard J. Daley's Chicago.
When Martin Luther King was marching down the street, people were coming all out of their houses, looking out the window. The children started running, telling their parents, "Here come Martin Luther King, here come Martin Luther King."
Chicago has been a symbol of hope for thousands of black men and women who fled first from the cruel yoke of slavery, and then again from the lawlessness and brutality of segregation in the Deep South.
It was a very exciting day. And then that evening on the news, we saw the people saying awful things to Martin Luther King, and they was throwing bricks and bottles.
The civil rights movement was a true test of loyalty for black machine Democrats. Daley was outraged by King's presence and considered him a troublemaker.
The mayor had his minions down, and you really didn't have to think. All you had to do was follow the leadership, vote the way the leadership votes, and that was it. They would see that you got reelected every time, and it was not a problem.
In Springfield, they hand what were called the idiot sheets. Idiot sheets would just say, Bill 102, vote yes, Bill 103, vote no, Bill 104, vote yes. And the idiot sheets would govern the voting for most members of the state legislature.
In exchange, these loyal captains received city, county, and state government jobs for themselves, their families, and friends. For blacks, this was critical, because even if they were well qualified, they could not find jobs in Chicago's business community. For many, government jobs were the only positions available.
You had Cecil Partee, who was one of the proteges of Campbell, who was the alderman and committeeman. You had Senator Smith, who was one of the oldest and longest-term senators who served there. In fact, but he too held a political job. You had Otis Collins, who was from the West Side, and he was sort of he was about as independent as he could be under the circumstances.
Certain black politicians couldn't say certain things or couldn't do certain things because their mama worked in the sewer department. And if they didn't toe the line, not only would they not be reelected the next time, but their mama would be fired the next day.
That's where their butter came from. They knew where it was, and they accepted it. And this was their thing. But from that, they were able to do things for their people, their organizations. The others, we were not.
However, with the increasing black consciousness of the 60s and the calls to actions that emanated from the black community, some legislators decided to follow their hearts instead of the party line.
But they have to act on conscience. And sometimes this angers white patrons. Sometimes this angers black political bosses.
Representative Cornel Davis, like many members of the regular Democratic Party at that time, would be excoriated from time to time for positions that they did not take. But I think almost to the person, anyone would tell you when it came to the issues of civil rights, though he was in the party, and the party was controlled by Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, on many occasions he stood in opposition to the party as it relates to public aid, as it relates to civil rights. Sometimes he got in trouble for it. Sometimes he was a lone voice fighting for it late at night in Springfield. I was there and I saw it.
By 1967, there were a record 18 black lawmakers seated in Springfield.
And the numbers, of course, continued to grow because the numbers have to be set in terms of the population. Every election, certainly every 10 years when the census came out after the court cases were settled over it, more blacks were sent to each legislative body. So you hit a critical mass.
For the first time, some of them had no ties or obligations to Chicago City Hall.
Now, the independent ones were Newhouse, who elected, who was elected in the liberal Hyde Park area, and Charlie Chu.
And even those that did found their allegiance changing. One such person was Harold Washington. He had started with the machine, but broke with it when the party line was inconsistent with the needs of his constituents.
We're calling for the Senate to pass, as the House has done, initiatory powers for the Fair Employment Practice Commission, because had the commission had those powers, they could have ferreted out a good many of these problems and perhaps would have resolved them by now.
Harold Washington, our late mayor, was a true workaholic. He was one of the brightest people in the assembly.
I could give Harold a paper I worked on for months, and he could read it in 2 seconds and seem to know it all.
Harold Washington would go on to make history as Chicago's first African-American mayor. The other well-known independent stalwart was Richard Newhouse. And then there was the flamboyant Charles Chu.
He was a master politician. He had more gall than anybody that you've ever seen. He would park in the governor's space down there, and they say, "Governor, he's parked in your spot down there." They say, "Look, if you put him out, he's going to get all the good publicity, and I'm going to get all the bad publicity. Let him stay there." And he would stay there. Charlie had more gumption, more guts.
As their numbers grew, black legislators saw the power in working together. In 1969, independent Democrats Lewis Caldwell, Raymond Ewell, Richard Newhouse, Calvin Smith, and former machine candidate Harold Washington organized a black caucus.
18 of us at the time, and there were 13 in the House and 5 in the Senate. There were 3 Republicans, which made our caucus a little more viable at the time, and there were 10 Democrats.
Yet 2/3 of the blacks in the House and Senate refused to join the caucus, fearful of losing their patronage jobs and their influence. As caucus members formulated their agenda, a leadership position for Cornel Davis became one of their top priorities. His classmate, Fred Smith, had advanced to the Senate, where he held leadership positions. Davis had never chaired a committee during his 3 decades in the General Assembly, even though these positions were awarded by seniority.
and we would always plot that if the election became close enough, we were going to formulate a block and not elect the speaker until he agreed to put Cornel into leadership. And Cornel had been there longer than anybody else, but had no respect.
He opened many doors. That's why I learned about the teachers downstate when they were paying African-American teachers less than they're paying white teachers. And he got Thurgood Marshall, who was a lawyer. He brought him down to Southern Illinois to break up that particular piece. When there was segregation in the dormitories at Illinois State University, he held up the budget. And that's when I learned about the budget, how you can use the budget to force a policy making decisions somewhere else for people who need those dollars.
But before black lawmakers could maneuver a leadership position for Davis, a rare leadership opportunity arose in the Senate. With the vote for President Pro Tem tied, all eyes were on the independent, Richard Newhouse.
Newhouse decided that he would not vote unless they had a black pro tem. And the fantastic part of the story is that in the House there were 5 black senators, and they were Kenny Hall, Cecil Partee, Fred Smith, and Dick Newhouse. Everybody else was on board. Dick Newhouse told the organization he wouldn't vote unless they had a black president, which was really a starting position for bargaining to see if we couldn't get some representation into leadership.
With so much at stake and no majority on either side of the aisle, Newhouse's vote was critical to both sides. He wouldn't give it to either one. W. Russell Arrington, a wealthy Republican, had been the president pro tem for years. Daley could risk this rare opportunity to unseat him, or he could select a black senator who was loyal to his machine. Daley did nothing. Then word came that Newhouse had been offered $250,000 to vote with the Republicans. Newhouse didn't flinch.
They bought votes at that day and era down in Springfield. Daley knew that $250,000 was the opening salvo as to where that vote would go. And he knew that by the time it got to $500,000, or maybe better, there were people in his own Democratic Party, plus many people from down in the Democratic Party in Southern Illinois, who will say, I'll take it and keep stepping. I don't have to be a representative, not for that kind of money. You know, they got their term, but nevertheless. Daley knew that someone would give up, and he sent orders down to make, he said, who do we have? They didn't want Charlie because Charlie was too flamboyant. Fred Smith was a little bit too old, you know, to understand the jam. Kenny Hall came from East St. Louis. Dick Newhouse was the outsider, and Cecil Partee was the person. Partee rode down with us that morning talking about how if he played his cards right, he could get to be a whip, which was, one of the minor positions. Mayor called and had all the Democrats change their vote and told them they had to vote for Cecil. They called up all the people on the phone. Those who were reluctant to go, he had their Chinaman, and the Chinaman refers to the person who sent you, call them and tell them to vote for Cecil.
The mayor had said to me that I should not say anything to anybody, but he wanted me as a leader, which has always caused a little bit of a rift between Senator Newhouse and I, because he's always felt that he maneuvered it, and that his threat of going or not voting or going to the other side or something would cause us to win it.
Partee made history when he became president of the Senate in 1971. Then, several years later, at Daley's urging, Partee stepped down to run as the Democratic nominee for Illinois Attorney General.
He was the first to run statewide. He was more or less, like I said, a trailblazer. He opened the doors for the Roland Burrises, the Jesse White. He was that trailblazer.
The race for Illinois Attorney General pitted Partee against incumbent William Scott, who was the highest Republican vote-getter in Illinois history. Partee, ever the party loyalist, had sacrificed his Senate presidency in vain. In the 70s, women, who had been working behind the scenes in politics for years, were now beginning to take their own seats in the General Assembly, and they were coming to start their own careers, not to complete the terms of their husbands or fathers. Among them was Chicago committeewoman Ethel Skiles Alexander, who arrived in Springfield in 1979. Her father, the Reverend Charles M. Skiles, had served 6 terms in the House during the middle 40s and 50s. He had been a machine politician. She, too, was slated by the Democratic organization.
I remember they led me into this darkened room, up 3 little flights of steps, set me in this chair with a big spotlight on me, and began to toss questions at me. What's my name? What is my background? What would happen if the party decided to slate me? Would I be loyal to the party? You don't know who's asking these questions. You just hear questions coming at you from all the room. You hear shuffling of chairs. You smell the cigar smoke and the cigarette smoke, and you're afraid. I was so afraid I didn't know what to do. I'm sitting there just like almost trembling. I'd never been in a setting like that before.
Earlene Collins' husband, Otis Collins, had also been a regular Democrat until his vigorous opposition to insurance company redlining in his district cost him the backing of City Hall. Years later, Earlene too would fight City Hall, not as a regular Democrat, but as a savvy independent.
Well, the first time I beat the Democratic machine when it was all powerful under the mayor, senior, and the candidate was even a friend of his, so I won. I had no organization.
Collins became the first African-American woman to be elected to the Senate. And later, as an independent Democrat, she became the first woman to hold a leadership position there, serving as both the assistant minority leader and the assistant majority leader. In 1981, Monica Faith Stewart became the youngest female elected to the House, fighting vigorously for reapportionment and women's rights. She would be followed by Kimberly Lightford of Maywood, who in 1999 would become the youngest African-American woman to be elected to the Senate.
The norm of the Senate is not a 30-year-old African-American female, so almost how do I fit in? But I didn't want to fit in. I decided that I wanted to create my own path and that I wanted to do what was best for my district and have a very diverse district.
Independent Arthur Turner tells of his early experience as a state legislator.
You choose seats based on seniority. And the irony of going to the legislature in my first term was I wound up sitting on the last row in the House of Representatives. That row had, I think there may have been one white person on that row. It was all black. And, you know, it is 1980, and I'm in the House of Representatives, and all the blacks are sitting on the last row. We're in the back row. In fact, that row picked up a name. It's called Catfish Row. And, you know, it was, you know, people would talk about Catfish Row, and it was just, that was it. But by the same token, I described myself and Monica and some of the younger people that came on board was a new breed of catfish, and that we were raised on catfish farms, and we were well-fed and understood the process.
The party leader was coming by, changing the votes, and Taylor Pouncey and Pouncey Taylor said, you know what? Because we were on Catfish Row. You know what? Let me tell you something, boss. We got a whole different breed of catfish down there. It's a whole different breed of catfish. Ain't that right, Sweet Pea? Because they called me Sweet Pea. Don't ask me why.
Among the best-known members of the legislature's new breed of independent black lawmakers was a dynamic young Chicago attorney in the class of 1979, Carol Mosley Braun. Braun credits her experience in Springfield, where she rose to become assistant majority leader, for preparing her to be the first black female United States senator. Others agree.
I always call it a great, great university because I learned something every day, each day I've been there. And my colleagues whom I serve with, both white and black, have been great teachers, and I hope that I have taught them equally as well.
Harold Washington led lost causes in Springfield. He also developed, I think, some very useful contacts in the press, and they would serve him in good stead throughout his political career.
I can recall my first bill. It was a circuit breaker for senior citizens. And after I made my opening statement of Sylvester Rem, state representative from the 26th district, I'm introducing this bill, and I froze in the middle of, of my presentation.
I remember the first time I spoke on the floor of the Senate. I forget what issue it was, but It was an issue that I was relatively passionate about. I stood up, made a pretty rousing speech in opposition to the bill, looked up at the board when the vote was taken, and I think I was one of 3 people who had voted against the bill. And one of my Republican colleagues came up to me and said, "You know, Barack, that was a wonderful speech. I think you changed a lot of minds, but you changed no votes."
That's when I got my political lessons of my life. I had a good chance of winning, but something happened over in the 17th Ward. They ran a guy named Jesse Jackson. And he wasn't the real Jesse Jackson, but he was Jesse Jackson. So he edged out the third party on that particular election.
In Springfield, one of the greatest lessons is that of the legislative process.
To get legislative through the process, you have to have support on both sides of the aisle. And to do that, you have to really understand your fellow colleagues, work with them, support them on issues that you know will not affect your beliefs.
I have found out that he needed a bridge in some little town somewhere where there's no bridge, and the bridge might not be going nowhere, but he needs a bridge. So I can go to him and say, I'll vote for you to get a bridge if you vote for me to get a swimming pool in Brainerd Park. And that is called pork.
Your vote is not as powerful when you're the 61st vote as it is when you're the 57th vote. So you learn how to use your vote to negotiate things for your district.
You have to put a larger coalition together in the Illinois House because you're dealing with 118 members. And in the Senate, you're dealing with 59 members. So you need 30 votes in the Senate and 60 in the House.
There are 26 African Americans in the entire General Assembly. It takes 60 votes to pass a bill. And without some of those African Americans, those 60 votes to pass a bill are not there. And that's because the Democrats are in charge of the House. Now, I want that to be perfectly clear. The Black Caucus in the General Assembly has a great opportunity to forge relationships, compromises, and to reach some conclusions based upon their ability or our ability to be the 60 votes that are needed in the House.
As the years progressed and the demographics changed, blacks found themselves representing districts outside the city of Chicago. In 2001, Chuck Jefferson was appointed as Rockford's first black representative. Dalton has had William Shaw. Maywood, Kimberly Lightford. Senator James Claiborne and Representative Wyvetta Young serve East St. Louis. The senior-most African-American member in the House of Representatives, Young has served since 1975.
Her entire life is about East St. Louis, and she's always, when she rises to speak, it's never about, it's got to be about East St. Louis. And she has a battle there because things aren't, the conditions in that city are sort of poor. But no one can ever say that Wyvetta Young is not the absolute appropriate representative for her area.
Today, black legislators are assuming increasingly powerful positions.
We have African Americans who are heading major committees. I am the Democratic lead person on the Revenue Committee.
I'm now the Assistant Minority Leader in the Senate, which is the second highest African American in the Senate. The Black Caucus put me into that position.
We were all pleased that we could get Senator Jones in as the Democratic leader.
When Emo Jones, the Democratic leader in the Senate, first ran for office, only 20% of the voters in his district were black. But still, he won a decisive victory. Since then, Jones has ushered through pivotal legislation promoting the interests of poor children.
The poor child in the school system generates a lot of dollars. These were state dollars. You also have federal dollars that was being spent on these children. And so in some instances, the poor child would bring in twice as much dollars to the educational system to meet their needs, but the programs were not being put there, And also they were not being spent, and in many instances they were getting less than the other children. And that's why it was such an injustice.
As a member of the legislature's top leadership, Jones is included in high-level decision-making. This has made a big difference to Illinois' black citizenry. Today, however, black state legislators are fighting one of the toughest battles ever: voter ignorance and apathy.
People miss the fact that we write the legislation, we write the laws for the state, and those laws supersede local laws.
A lot of the things that really have an impact on your day-to-day takes place in state government, and people don't recognize it.
Most people I talk to, and even the older ones, they don't really realize that what a state representative or state senator does. They tend to confuse it with a congressman.
Springfield legislators control practically everything that happens in the state.
Your working environment, your school environment is pretty much determined by those people who you have voted or didn't vote for.
It is the main government about it. It governs your life from the time you're born to the time you die.
Department of Children and Family Services, mental health, public health, our education system, the school system depend upon the dollars that are necessary to educate our young people, so it can affect your life in every way.
Those who don't do politics will have politics done to them. So to deny that we need to be engaged in that section of politics that is elected and appointed and in charge of the decisions that affect all of our lives is to be extremely foolish, and certainly we are not a foolish people.
I spend a lot of my time trying to trickle some of that $65 billion budget back to my community.
Every time you get gas, every time you buy bubble gum, you're paying taxes, so fight for your fair share of that money.
Black legislators are very important. We're right there on the front lines in those type of battles.
In the 125 years since blacks have held seats in the Illinois legislature, their numbers, their influence, their freedom, and their power have increased immeasurably, although disappointments and setbacks have been part of the black experience in America. In 1877, Illinois' black community had one voice in the state legislature. Today, it has had over 100. These black legislators, their story, is not so much about the specific individuals who served, but the path that was created. A path to civil liberties started over 100 years ago.
I really applaud our first legislators. I feel they came through during a period perhaps of turmoil when African Americans were in the most need.
Their legacy was that people used politics as a form of vigilance to protect civil rights. These weren't the big issues, and these weren't the big events. But for African Americans, they were often life and death.
They've been down there in small numbers for years. They've grown in numbers and in stature. They've clustered, united into a caucus. They're now a force to be reckoned with. They're truly pioneers in the struggle.